Every sentence seems like a discovery the world ignored. The Soviet counteroffensive launched on December 5, 1941, near Moscow, was one of the most unexpected and dramatic reversals of World War II. For months, the German army had driven deep into the Soviet Union, capturing millions of prisoners and pushing ever closer to the Soviet capital. Hitler and his generals were convinced the Soviet Union was on the edge of collapse. Yet, on that freezing winter day, the Red Army struck back with a powerful counterattack that shocked the world, shattered the myth of invincible blitzkrieg, and marked the beginning of Nazi Germany's long decline. The story begins in late autumn 1941. German forces, exhausted but still pushing forward, had reached the very outskirts of Moscow. Patrols claimed they could see the glow of the city lights on the horizon. German newspapers confidently predicted that Christmas would be celebrated in the Kremlin. Hitler boasted that Moscow would fall within days and that the Soviet regime would crumble soon after. But the rapid advance had come at a terrible price. German soldiers had marched thousands of kilometers with little rest, supply lines were overstretched, and fuel, ammunition, and food were in short supply. Above all, the German high command had fatally underestimated the Russian climate. They had planned for a short summer campaign, not a prolonged struggle in sub-zero temperatures. By late November, temperatures plunged to minus 20 degrees Celsius, then minus 30 degrees Celsius, and in some places even minus 40 degrees Celsius. Engines froze solid, oil thickened, and rifles jammed. Horses died in the snow. Soldiers wrapped themselves in blankets, curtains, and rags, anything they could find, to resist the cold. Many froze to death in their trenches. The German army, built for speed and mobility, suddenly found itself immobilized by mud, ice, and bitter cold. Meanwhile, the Soviets were preparing a response the Germans did not expect. Throughout November, reinforcements quietly arrived from the Far East, battle-hardened Siberian divisions trained to fight in extreme cold. These units were only released once Soviet intelligence confirmed that Japan would not attack the USSR from the east. Fresh, well-equipped, and accustomed to winter warfare, they became the core of a new offensive force. Inside Moscow, the situation was desperate, but not hopeless. Factories continued to work day and night, producing weapons and ammunition even as bombs fell nearby. Civilians dug trenches and anti-tank ditches, built barricades, and prepared for street fighting. Food and fuel were scarce, but morale was strengthened when Stalin chose to remain in the capital rather than evacuate. His decision sent a clear message: Moscow would be defended at any cost. By early December, Soviet commanders such as Zhukov, Rokossky, Konev, and Vlasov had completed plans for a large counteroffensive. They intended to strike along a wide front and push German forces away from Moscow. The Red Army still faced serious shortages and had suffered enormous losses. But now it held certain advantages: fresh reserves, shorter supply lines, and far better winter equipment than its enemy. It remained a huge gamble. The Germans, though exhausted, were still dangerous, and a failed counterattack could have opened the road to Moscow again. But Soviet leaders understood that if the capital fell, the political and psychological consequences could be fatal. There was no choice but to attack. At dawn on December 5th, 1941, the Red Army launched its counterstrike. The assault began with a massive artillery bombardment that shook the frozen ground. Moments later, waves of Soviet infantry advanced through deep snow, many wearing white camouflage that blended with the winter landscape. Tanks with engines adapted to the cold rumbled forward, while Siberian ski battalions slipped through forests to hit German positions from the flanks. The Germans were stunned. For months, they had been on the offensive. Suddenly, they found themselves under a coordinated, large-scale attack for which they were completely unprepared. The extreme cold made it almost impossible to move vehicles or reposition heavy weapons quickly. Many units were already under strength, and the soldiers were physically and mentally exhausted. German survivors later recalled their disbelief when the Soviets attacked. They had assumed the Red Army was broken beyond repair. Instead, they witnessed determined Soviet forces surging forward, supported by fresh troops, artillery, and growing air support. The psychological impact was immense. The hunter had become the hunted. By December 7th, the German front began to buckle in several sectors. Units retreated for the first time on such a scale. Villages and towns that had been captured only weeks earlier were hastily abandoned. Frozen roads turned every withdrawal into a nightmare as vehicles slid, broke down, or were left behind. Soviet cavalry and ski troops pursued, cutting off supply columns and overrunning isolated outposts. One of the most important Soviet successes came to the west of Moscow, where the Red Army recaptured Klin and Solninikisk, pushing German forces away from the Volokholamsk highway, the most direct road to the Kremlin. In the south, Soviet troops relieved Tula, whose defenders had held out stubbornly against repeated German attacks. Step by step, the ring around Moscow was pushed outward. By mid-December, panic spread in the German high command. For the first time, Hitler had to accept that his strategy had failed to deliver the quick victory he had promised. He issued an order forbidding any retreat, insisting that positions be held at all costs. But reality on the front made such commands impossible to obey. Soldiers suffering from frostbite, hunger, and constant Soviet pressure could not hold their lines indefinitely. At the same time, the Red Army continued to gain strength. Partisan units behind German lines sabotaged railways and communications. Civilians provided food, winter clothing, and shelter to Soviet troops. The Soviet Air Force, previously devastated, began to reappear in the skies. The momentum of the battle had clearly shifted. By the end of December 1941, German forces had been driven back between 100 and 250 kilometers from Moscow. What had begun as a desperate defensive struggle transformed into a successful offensive. For the first time, the world saw that the Soviet Union was not only capable of resisting, but of defeating the Wehrmacht in open battle. The international response was immediate. British newspapers hailed the Soviet counteroffensive as a miracle and a turning point. American observers reported with astonishment that the impossible has happened. Even neutral states reassessed their view of the conflict. The Red Army's success near Moscow demonstrated that Nazi Germany could be stopped. The December counteroffensive did not win the war by itself, nor did it destroy the German army, but it broke the illusion of Nazi invincibility, saved Moscow from capture, and showed that the Soviet Union would not collapse under pressure. December 5th, 1941, thus stands as the moment that the Soviet Union, standing on the edge of destruction, struck back with devastating force. It marked the beginning of a long, brutal road that would, years later, end in Berlin.